On September 14, 2023, at 10:30 a.m., what should have been the happiest day in the life of 35-year-old nurse Claudia Neumann was about to begin. Instead, it ended in a nightmare when the registrar stopped their wedding ceremony and revealed that her fiancé, Dr. Samir Haddad, was not a doctor, but a patient in a closed psychiatric facility with forged documents. Claudia Neumann was a woman who had dedicated her life to healing others. For 12 years, she had worked as a nurse at the renowned private clinic, St. Elizabeth, in Dusseldorf, where she was valued for her empathy and professionalism. With her warm brown eyes, chestnut hair, and gentle smile, she embodied the image of a caring healer. But behind her professional competence lay a deep longing for emotional security. After the painful end of her 6-year relationship to Marcus, a craftsman who had left her for a younger colleague, Claudia sought a partner who could offer her the stability that had been missing. She dreamed of a man with education, status, and a respectable profession, someone who would give her the feeling of finally having arrived. Samir Haddad seemed to be the embodiment of all her dreams. The 37-year-old man from Aleppo presented himself as a doctor in training who was building a new existence in Germany after fleeing Syria. With his well-groomed appearance, charming accent, and stories about humanitarian work in war zones, he seemed like the ideal partner for a nurse who herself saved lives daily. What Claudia didn't know, Samir Haddad was neither a doctor nor a refugee in the traditional sense. He was a man with severe mental illness who had been moving between various psychiatric institutions for years and had become a master at creating false identities. His true art lay in recognizing the longings and weaknesses of empathetic women and manipulating them for his own purposes. The story of Claudia and Samir is not only the story of deception, but a shocking example of how mentally ill perpetrators use their victims' helpfulness and empathy as weapons against them. It is the story of a woman who believed she was saving a lifesaver and nearly destroyed her own life in the process. It was a rainy Thursday evening in February 2023 when Claudia Neumann was working a shift in the emergency department of St. Joseph Hospital. She actually worked at the private clinic, but had agreed to fill in because a colleague had called in sick. The shift had been exhausting. A traffic accident with multiple injuries, a heart attack, and the usual cases of an urban emergency room. Around 10 p.m., a man entered the emergency room who immediately caught Claudia's attention. He was tall and slim, wore an elegant dark coat over a white shirt, and despite the late hour, appeared well-groomed and dignified. His dark eyes searched the room helplessly, and when they spotted Claudia, his tense face relaxed. "Excuse me," he said with a charming accent. "I'm looking for Dr. Weber. I'm Dr. Samir Haddad, assistant physician in internal medicine at the university clinic. We treated a patient together today, and I wanted to inquire about his condition." Claudia was impressed by his polite manner and professional demeanor. "Dr. Weber finished his shift today," she replied, "but I'd be happy to help you. Which patient are you referring to?" What followed was a 15-minute conversation about an alleged patient named Ahmed, involving complicated internal medicine diagnoses. Samir spoke with an expertise that impressed Claudia and showed an empathy for the patient that she, as a nurse, particularly appreciated. "It's nice to meet a doctor who truly cares about patients," Claudia said when they realized the patient in question wasn't in their department. "That's not always a given." Samir's eyes lit up. "Medicine without humanity is just technology," he replied. "Especially for someone like me who had to leave his homeland, it's important to do something good here, to give back what helped me." In that moment, Samir skillfully activated the first psychological lever. He presented himself as someone who was both professionally successful and personally vulnerable, a combination that appealed equally to Claudia's helper instinct and her need for a strong but sensitive partner. The conversation was interrupted when a new emergency was brought in. Samir immediately offered his help, even though he had actually already finished his shift. Claudia watched, fascinated, as he behaved professionally, used medical terms correctly, and communicated with other doctors as an equal. What she didn't know, Samir had been practicing this role for months. He had hung around hospitals, studied medical journals, and observed doctors' behavior. His psychiatric illness was paired with extraordinary intelligence that enabled him to learn complex roles and play them convincingly. "May I invite you for coffee?" Samir asked when their shifts ended. "It's rare that I meet someone who views medicine with the same passion as I do." Claudia hesitated only a moment. Normally, she didn't go out with strangers, but Samir was a colleague, and she felt drawn to him. "I'd like that," she answered with a smile. In a small cafe near the hospital, they sat until 3 in the morning talking about medicine, about life, about their dreams and fears. Samir told of his flight from Syria, of his medical studies in Aleppo that were interrupted by the war, and his difficult new beginning in Germany. "I practically had to start over here," he said with a sadness in his voice that broke Claudia's heart. "Recognition of my diploma took years, but I'm grateful for every chance to work as a doctor again." Claudia was deeply moved by his story. Here was a man who, despite all adversities, pursued his dream of helping others, a man who combined education, status, and deep humanity, exactly what she had been looking for. When they said goodbye, they exchanged phone numbers. "I would like to see you again," Samir said, taking her hand, "if you'd like to have a real date." On the way home, Claudia felt an excitement she hadn't experienced in a long time. Finally, she had met someone who fulfilled all her criteria: intelligent, educated, empathetic, and with a respectable profession. That he was also attractive and charming seemed almost too good to be true, and that's exactly what it was. If you're fascinated by similar stories, then subscribe to this channel. We regularly uncover shocking cases that show how perpetrators exploit their victims' weaknesses and how to protect yourself. The first weeks of their relationship felt like a fairy tale to Claudia. Samir was the attentive, romantic partner she had always wished for. He sent her loving messages daily, brought her flowers, and showed genuine interest in her life and work. "How was your day in the ICU?" he asked every evening when they met. He listened attentively when she talked about difficult patients and gave professional advice that showed he understood the medical connections. Particularly impressive was his way of talking about his own work. He told of complex diagnoses, of patients he had saved, and of the challenge of gaining a foothold in Germany as a foreign doctor. His stories were detailed and emotionally gripping, peppered with medical terminology that underscored his credibility. "Yesterday we had a young man with acute pancreatitis," he told during one of their dinners. "The lab values were borderline, but I had the feeling there was more to it. Fortunately, I insisted on additional imaging. We were able to detect beginning necrosis in time." Claudia hung on his every word. Here was a doctor who was not only technically competent but also had the courage to decide against protocols when patient welfare was at stake. A doctor after her own heart. What Claudia didn't suspect, Samir derived his medical knowledge from intensive study of professional journals and online sources. As a patient in various psychiatric institutions, he had had years of access to medical libraries and used his photographic memory to acquire impressive half-knowledge. After 6 weeks, Samir executed the next step of his psychological plan. He began carefully sowing doubts about Claudia's previous life, while presenting himself as the solution to all her problems. "You deserve so much more," he said one evening as she talked about her work. "You're intelligent, competent, and have a heart for people. Why are you wasting your talent on a private clinic where it's all about money? At a university hospital, you could really make a difference." Claudia was flattered by his high opinion of her, but also thoughtful. "I don't know," she replied. "The private clinic pays well, and I have security there." "Security is important," Samir agreed. "But don't we grow through challenges? I could help you make connections. As a doctor, I know the right people." This was a classic manipulation trick. Samir presented himself as someone who recognized Claudia's hidden potential and could help her unfold it. At the same time, he made her dependent on his alleged connections and influence. The relationship intensified quickly. Samir was the perfect companion for social occasions. He could converse about art, literature, and politics, spoke several languages, and always had interesting stories to tell. Claudia's colleagues were impressed by her new partner, which boosted her self-esteem. "You've really caught yourself a dream man," her colleague Sarah said enviously. "Intelligent, attractive, and a doctor. What more could you want?" Only one person was skeptical: Claudia's best friend, Miriam Kruger. The 33-year-old lawyer had a sharp mind and healthy distrust of people who seemed too perfect. "Don't you find it strange that he never talks concretely about his work?" Miriam asked during a girls' night out. "I mean, as a lawyer, I constantly talk about my cases. Where exactly does he work? Which department? Who's his supervisor?" Claudia felt attacked. "He's discreet about his patients. That's professional and ethically correct." "Claudia, I don't mean it badly. Miriam persisted. But you've only known him for 2 months. Are you sure he really is who he claims to be? You're just jealous, Claudia replied more sharply than intended. You can't stand that I'm finally happy. This fight with her best friend was no coincidence. Samir had been subtly working to isolate Claudia from her social environment. He had never spoken directly badly about Miriam, but had made small remarks like, "Your friend seems very critical. It's probably hard for her to see you happy." Isolation from critical voices is a classic element of psychological manipulation. The perpetrator ensures that the victim only hears his perspective and interprets alternative viewpoints as attacks or envy. At the same time, Samir intensified his emotional control over Claudia. He began incorporating small tests, situations where he tested her loyalty and trust. "I have a problem at work," he confessed to her after 3 months of relationship. "A colleague is trying to discredit me. He claims my training isn't recognized. It's obviously xenophobically motivated, but it burdens me greatly." Claudia was immediately alarmed and offered her support. "What can I do? Should I speak to someone?" "No," Samir replied quickly. "That could make everything worse. I just need your support and trust. Sometimes I think you're the only person who really believes in me." With this strategy, Samir bound Claudia even more emotionally to himself. He presented himself as an innocently persecuted man who only had her as an ally. At the same time, he tested her willingness to support him unconditionally, even without having evidence for his claims. When they made love for the first time in the 15th week of their relationship, Claudia was convinced she had found the man of her life. Samir was tender, attentive, and seemed to truly love her. Afterward, as she lay in his arms, he whispered, "I've never loved anyone the way I love you. You give my life in Germany meaning." Claudia was overwhelmed with happiness. Finally, she had found someone who not only loved her, but also needed her. She felt important, valuable, and protected. That these feelings were the result of months of psychological manipulation didn't occur to her. She couldn't suspect that Samir was courting 2 other women at the same time and telling them similar stories, adapted to their respective needs and weaknesses. In May 2023, after 4 months of relationship, Samir led his plan into the next phase. He began carefully broaching the topic of the future, while simultaneously thematizing his allegedly difficult financial situation. "You know, Claudia," he said one evening as they sat in their favorite cafe, "since I've known you, I'm thinking about a real future for the first time again, about a shared life, maybe even a family." Claudia's heart beat faster. At 35, she had long given up hope that she would still find the right partner and start a family. Samir's words awakened hopes she thought she had buried deep. "Do you mean that seriously?" she asked cautiously. "Of course, I mean it seriously," Samir replied, taking her hand. "You're the woman I've been waiting for my whole life. Someone who understands me, who shares my path, who knows what it means to help others." In the following weeks, Samir painted a seductive picture of their shared future. He spoke of a joint practice they could run, of travels to Syria when the war was over to provide humanitarian aid together, of children who could inherit their passion for medicine. "Imagine," he enthused, "a practice where doctor and nurse complement each other perfectly. You with your experience and empathy, me with my medical training. We could really make a difference." Claudia was enchanted by this vision. Finally, someone who not only understood her dreams but exceeded them. She began making concrete plans, saved money for their shared future, and even reduced her expenses to put more aside for their life together. At the same time, Samir began subtly mentioning his financial plight. It started with small remarks about the difficult situation of foreign doctors in Germany. "The German system is so complicated for us," he complained. "The bureaucracy, the recognition of certificates, the additional exams, everything costs money, a lot of money. Sometimes I think I should have started over in another country." Claudia listened and offered her emotional support. She admired his perseverance and willingness to overcome all obstacles to work as a doctor. After a few weeks, Samir became more concrete. "I have to confess something to you," he said one evening with a dejected expression. "My financial situation is more precarious than I wanted to admit. The costs for recognizing my studies, the language courses, the continuing education, it's more than I can afford." Claudia was concerned. "Why didn't you tell me earlier? We could have found a solution." "I didn't want you to think of me as a failure," Samir replied with feigned shame. "A man should be able to provide for himself, but in Germany everything is so expensive, and as an assistant physician, I don't earn much." This was a perfectly staged emotional appeal. Samir presented himself as a proud man who only reluctantly admitted his weakness, but also as someone who had to overcome structural obstacles. He activated Claudia's protective instinct and her sense of justice. "How much do you need?" Claudia asked impulsively. Samir seemed surprised by her direct question. "Oh no, I didn't want. I can't expect you to." "Samir," Claudia interrupted decisively, "if we want to have a future together, then we have to help each other. You would do the same for me." "You're incredible," Samir said and kissed her. "I need about 3,000 euros for the final exam fees and an intensive course in medical German, but I only want it as a loan. As soon as I get recognition and find a better position, I'll pay you back everything." 3,000 euros was a considerable sum for Claudia, almost all her savings. But the investment in Samir's future was an investment in their shared future. Without hesitation, she agreed. "You're not just saving my career with this, but our whole life," Samir said, overwhelmed. "I'll never forget this." What Claudia didn't know: the money didn't flow into exam fees or language courses, but directly into Samir's daily expenses and his elaborate staging as a successful doctor. The expensive suits, the fine restaurants, the small gifts, everything was financed by his victim's savings. In this phase, Samir also intensified his emotional control. He became jealous of Claudia's time with other people and managed to convince her that their relationship was so special that it deserved the complete focus of both partners. "Don't misunderstand me," he said after an evening when Claudia had gone out with colleagues, "but sometimes I have the feeling that other people don't understand our connection. They only see the surface, not the deep spiritual and emotional connection we have." Subtly, he implied that Claudia's social contacts were superficial compared to their special relationship. Slowly but surely, Claudia reduced her activities with friends and colleagues and spent almost all her free time with Samir. The fight with her best friend Miriam escalated when she asked direct questions about Samir. "Claudia, I'm really worried," Miriam said during a rare meeting. "You've completely changed. You only talk about him. You hardly see your other friends anymore. And now you're lending him money too? These are classic warning signs." "You don't understand," Claudia replied coldly. "Samir and I have something special. We're planning a future together. When I help him now, I'm helping both of us." "But what do you really know about him?" Miriam persisted. "Have you ever seen his workplace? Met his colleagues? Any concrete evidence for his story?" Claudia was angry. These questions felt like attacks on her relationship and her judgment. "You're just jealous because you don't have anyone yourself," she said hurtfully. "I don't need evidence because I trust him. That's called love." After this fight, the two women didn't speak for weeks. Claudia was sad about losing her best friend, but Samir comforted her with the words, "People who truly love you support your happiness. The others fall away by themselves." The isolation was complete. Claudia had not only lost her best friend, but also the critical outside perspective that could have helped her see through Samir's manipulation. When Samir returned from a business trip in July 2023, actually a stay in a psychiatric clinic in Hamburg, he brought an engagement ring. "Claudia," he said as he knelt before her, "you've shown me what true love means. You believed in me when no one else did. Will you be my wife?" Through tears of joy, Claudia said yes. Finally, she had found her dream man. Finally, she would marry and start a family. The ring was beautiful, elegant, and expensive, paid for with her own money, without her suspecting it. The engagement marked the climax of Samir's psychological manipulation. Claudia was now completely emotionally and financially dependent on him, isolated from critical voices, and convinced that their relationship was something very special that suspended the normal rules of caution. What she didn't know: for Samir, the wedding wasn't the beginning of their shared future, but the final step in a carefully planned fraud that would completely destroy her life. The engagement triggered a wave of euphoria in Claudia. After years of loneliness and uncertainty, she had finally found the man who could fulfill all her dreams. Wedding planning became her main occupation, and she threw herself into it with a passion that surprised everyone around her. Samir was the perfect fiancé. He was interested in every detail, had opinions about flowers, music, and the menu, and seemed just as excited as Claudia herself. Only on one point was he reserved: the guest list. "You understand," he explained with a sad smile. "My family is in Syria, and most of my friends are scattered across Europe. It would be very difficult for them to come, and honestly, I don't want our special day to be overshadowed by the sadness of my past." Claudia was touched by his sensitivity. "Of course I understand," she replied. "It will be a small, intimate celebration anyway, family and a few close friends." What she didn't notice was that Samir systematically ensured the wedding party would be as small as possible. He expressed subtle concerns about various guests. "Aren't your work colleagues a bit superficial for such a special day?" Or, "Do you think your brother will be comfortable at such an elegant celebration?" Piece by piece, the guest list shrank to a minimum. Miriam wasn't invited after their fight anyway. Other friendships had cooled through Samir's subtle influence. In the end, only Claudia's parents, her brother, and 2 work colleagues were supposed to attend the civil ceremony. The wedding costs rose continuously. The elegant restaurant Samir had chosen was significantly more expensive than originally planned. The photographer he had recommended demanded a surcharge for documenting a German-Syrian union. The flowers had to be meaningful and exotic, which doubled the price. "I'm sorry," Samir said with feigned shame as the bills got higher and higher. "I didn't want it to be so expensive, but you deserve only the best, and I want this day to be perfect for us." Claudia hesitated briefly when she had to pull out her credit card for the photographer. "Samir, this is all getting very expensive. Maybe we should celebrate more modestly?" "You're right," he replied immediately. "I'm being selfish. I just wanted our wedding to be something very special because you're something very special. But of course we can save. Forget the photographer. Forget the special flowers. A simple ceremony is perfectly fine." His apparent willingness to give up everything made Claudia feel guilty. "No," she said quickly. "You're right, it's our big day. We'll manage somehow." This was a perfect example of emotional manipulation through apparent selflessness. By offering to give up everything, Samir practically forced Claudia to justify and pay for the high expenses. Parallel to wedding planning, Samir developed new crises that required Claudia's emotional and financial support. His stories became increasingly dramatic and urgent. "I received terrible news from Syria," he told her one evening with a tear-choked voice. "My sister was injured in a bombing. She's in the hospital in Aleppo and urgently needs an operation she can't afford." Claudia was shattered. "What can we do? Can we send money? That's the problem," Samir explained. "Banks don't work properly in war zones. I would have to transfer the money through special channels, and that costs additional fees. She needs about 2,000 euros for the operation and follow-up treatment." Without hesitation, Claudia offered to provide the money. "Of course we'll help her. She's going to be my sister-in-law soon." Samir hugged her, crying, "You're an angel. Without you, my family would be lost." The story of the injured sister was completely fabricated, like all his family stories. But for Claudia, it was absolutely real and reinforced her feeling of not only loving Samir, but also being part of a larger, tragic story in which she played the rescuing heroine. In the weeks before the wedding, Samir's emotional crises multiplied. He had nightmares about the war, panic attacks due to his work stress, and depressive episodes in which he doubted his worth as a man and partner. "Sometimes I think you deserve someone better," he said after a particularly intense breakdown. "Someone without my past, without my problems. A German man with a simple, unburdened history." "Never say that again," Claudia replied decisively and took him in her arms. "You're the strongest man I know. What you've been through has made you who you are. I love not only your strength, but also your vulnerability." These emotional roller coasters served several purposes. They strengthened Claudia's protective instinct, made her feel needed and important, and they normalized dramatic emotional outbursts, so that Claudia interpreted later warning signs as part of Samir's traumatic past, rather than recognizing them as signs of his mental instability. 2 weeks before the wedding came the most serious incident yet. Samir didn't show up for their planned dinner and didn't answer calls or messages. Claudia was in panic and drove to his alleged home address that he had given her. The building existed, but it was an empty office building. There was no apartment, no Samir, no explanation. Claudia stood confused and anxious in front of the dark building, no longer understanding the world. The next morning, Samir called, his voice weak and broken. "Claudia, I'm so sorry. I was in the hospital. A breakdown. The doctors say it was stress and exhaustion." He explained that he hadn't been home because he was ashamed to show her his weakness. The wrong address was a misunderstanding, He had been staying temporarily with a colleague and hadn't told her the truth out of pride. "I didn't want you to think I was a failure," he sobbed on the phone. "A man who can't even have his own apartment." Claudia's anger melted away immediately. Instead of questioning the obvious contradictions, she focused on Samir's emotional pain and her own role as his rescuer. "You're not a failure," she said gently. "You're a survivor. We'll get through this together. After the wedding, you'll just move in with me, then we'll have a shared address." What Claudia didn't know, Samir had spent the last 2 days in a psychiatric emergency room after suffering a psychotic breakdown in another part of the city. His treating psychiatrist had urgently recommended keeping him in inpatient treatment longer, but Samir had insisted on being discharged because he had important appointments. September 14, 2023, began for Claudia like the most beautiful day of her life. She woke up early, filled with a mixture of nervousness and anticipation that she hadn't felt since childhood. Today, she would finally become Samir's wife. Today, her new life would begin. She had consciously chosen a simple, elegant dress, cream-colored, knee-length, with subtle lace details. Nothing too elaborate for a civil ceremony, but festive enough for the most important day of her life. As she got ready, she thought about the future ahead of them, the joint practice, the travels, maybe even children. Samir had insisted they meet only at the registry office. "It brings bad luck if the groom sees the bride before the ceremony," he had explained with a charming smile. "I know it's old-fashioned, but let's respect all traditions." At 10 o'clock, Claudia drove with her parents to the registry office. Her mother, a resolute woman of 62, who had long been skeptical of Samir's quick appearance in Claudia's life, had finally made peace with the situation. Her father, a quiet engineer, had said little but given his approval when he saw how happy his daughter was. "You're particularly radiant today," her mother said as they stood in front of the imposing building. "I hope he makes you happy, this Samir." "He already does," Claudia replied convincingly. "He's the best man I can imagine." At the registry office, Claudia's brother Thomas and her 2 work colleagues, Sarah and Jenny, were already waiting. The small group seemed lost in the large waiting area, but that didn't bother Claudia. An intimate celebration was exactly what she had wanted. At exactly 10:30, the ceremony was supposed to begin, but Samir wasn't there. Claudia nervously looked at her watch and tried to call him, but his phone was turned off. "Maybe he's stuck in traffic," Sarah said reassuringly, "or he's looking for a parking space." Mr. Lehman, the registrar, an experienced man of 52 with gray temples and friendly eyes, approached them. "Miss Neumann, I'm Werner Lehman. Where is your fiancé? We should begin in 10 minutes. He should be here any moment," Claudia replied with a nervous smile. "May I call him again?" Again, Samir's phone was turned off. Claudia began to worry. What if something had happened to him? What if he was having one of his emotional breakdowns? At 11 o'clock, Samir still wasn't there. The small wedding party waited restlessly, and Mr. Lehman kept looking at his watch. "Miss Neumann," he finally said, "do you have a way to reach your fiancé? We have other appointments after yours." Suddenly, the entrance door opened and Samir stormed in. He looked harried, his hair was disheveled, and his suit looked as if he had slept in it, but he smiled broadly when he saw Claudia. "I'm so sorry," he called breathlessly. "An emergency at the hospital. A patient collapsed, and I had to stay until a colleague arrived. You know how it is. Life comes first." Claudia was relieved, and at the same time proud of her future husband. Even on his wedding day, he didn't neglect his professional obligations. That showed what a responsible doctor he was. "It doesn't matter," she said and kissed him. "The main thing is that you're here." Mr. Lehman cleared his throat. "Then we can begin. Do you have all the required documents with you?" Claudia nodded and handed over her papers. Birth certificate, identity card, certificate of no impediment. Everything was in order. Samir pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket and gave it to the registrar. "Here are my papers," he said. "Sorry for the delay." Mr. Lehman opened the envelope and began examining the documents. It was routine for him. He had already conducted thousands of marriages. But when he looked more closely at Samir's birth certificate, he frowned. "Mr. Haddad," he said slowly. "This birth certificate, are you sure this is your full name?" "Yes, of course," Samir replied quickly. "Samir Ahmad Haddad." "Why?" Mr. Lehman looked back and forth between the document and Samir. "It's just, this certificate looks very new for someone who was born in 1986. An uneasy feeling spread in Claudia's stomach. Why was the registrar asking such questions? Why did Samir suddenly seem nervous? I had to apply for a new one, Samir explained hastily. The old one was lost during my flight. The German embassy in Turkey helped me get a copy. Mr. Lehman nodded, but his expression remained skeptical. He looked at the rest of the documents: a residence permit, a registration certificate, proof of his alleged profession. Mr. Haddad, he finally said, could you and your fiancé please accompany me to my office for a moment? Claudia felt her heart beating faster. Is something wrong? It's just a formality, Mr. Lehman replied, but his tone had become serious. I need to clarify some details. In the small office of the registrar, a scene unfolded that would change Claudia's life forever. Mr. Lehman laid the documents on his desk and looked at Samir penetratingly. Mr. Haddad, he began, I've been doing this job for over 20 years, and I've developed a good sense for unusual situations. These documents raise questions. Samir tried to appear calm, but Claudia noticed how his hands were trembling. What questions? Everything is legal and correct. That may be, Mr. Lehman replied, but I'm obligated to verify suspicious documents, especially with international marriages. We have to be very careful. He reached for the phone. I'll briefly call the responsible authority to verify the authenticity of your papers. That's not necessary, Samir said quickly and stood up. We can come back at another time if you have concerns. Please sit down, Mr. Lehman said firmly. It will only take a few minutes. What happened in the next 30 minutes destroyed Claudia's entire worldview. The first call revealed that the given address in Dusseldorf didn't exist. The second call to the alleged clinic where Samir worked revealed that no one with that name was employed there. Mr. Haddad, Mr. Lehman said seriously, I have some discrepancies here. Can you explain these? Samir began to sweat. His composure visibly crumbled. There must be misunderstandings. Maybe you called the wrong department. The third call was decisive. Mr. Lehman had checked the residence permit and was transferred to an authority in Cologne. After a lengthy conversation, he hung up and looked at Samir with a mixture of confusion and horror. Mr. Whoever you are, he said slowly, the person named Samir Ahmed Haddad, whose identity you're claiming, has been a patient in a closed psychiatric facility in Cologne for 3 years. He was never a doctor but suffers from severe psychotic disorder with delusions of grandeur. The words hit Claudia like blows. What is that supposed to mean? She stammered. Mr. Lehman looked at her with pity. It means that the man you wanted to marry is not who he claims to be. His true identity is still unknown to us. At that moment, Samir's carefully constructed facade completely collapsed. His face contorted, his eyes took on a wild expression, and he began laughing hysterically. You understand nothing, he suddenly screamed. Nothing. I'm a genius. I'm superior to everyone. This stupid German bureaucracy can't stop me. Claudia sat petrified, unable to comprehend what was happening. The man she loved, wanted to marry, who was her future, was transforming before her eyes into a stranger. Claudia, Samir shouted and turned to her. His face was now completely distorted. You stupid fish. Did you really believe a doctor would be interested in a cheap nurse? You were just a means to an end. The cruelty of his words, the sudden change from love to hate, made Claudia break down. She began crying uncontrollably, while Mr. Lehman was already calling the police. The wedding will not take place, he told the waiting guests outside. It has been discovered that the groom has acted under false identity. The police are on their way. When the officers arrived, Samir was still in his psychotic state. He berated everyone present, claimed to be an unrecognized genius, and that the world would one day acknowledge his superiority. While he was being led away, he looked at Claudia one last time. You weren't the first, and you won't be the last, he said with cold calculation. It's so easy to manipulate you lonely women. These words burned into Claudia's memory and haunted her long after that fateful day. The hours after the failed wedding passed like a nightmare. Claudia sat in a side room of the registry office, still in her wedding dress, staring at the wall while outside the police conducted their investigation. Her parents, brother, and colleagues tried to comfort her, but their words didn't penetrate. Claudia, do you hear me? Her mother asked worriedly, stroking her hair. Everything will be fine. You escaped that monster. But Claudia didn't feel like someone who had escaped. She felt like someone whose entire life had been built on a lie. Every memory, every conversation, every tender moment with Samir was poisoned by the realization that none of it had been real. Detective Weber, an experienced investigator from the fraud department, conducted a detailed interview with Claudia. His questions were factual but not unfriendly, as he tried to understand the extent of Samir's deception. "Miss Neumann," he said gently, "I know this is difficult for you, but I need to understand how long this relationship lasted and what financial damages occurred." Claudia answered mechanically to his questions. 8 months of relationship, 5,000 euros in direct money transfers, all the costs for the planned wedding, probably even more that she couldn't overview at the moment. "Do you have evidence of the money transfers?" Detective Weber asked. With trembling hands, Claudia showed him her bank statements on her phone. The transfers were all there. 3,000 euros for his alleged exam fees, 2,000 euros for his allegedly injured sister, hundreds of euros for shared expenses she had paid. "This is a classic case of romance scam," the detective explained. "Only this time, not over the internet, but in person. That makes it particularly insidious." While Claudia was being questioned, the officers conducted further investigations. The true identity of the man who had posed as Samir Haddad turned out to be even more shocking than they had expected. His real name was Kemal Özkan, a 32-year-old German with Turkish roots from Essen. He had never studied medicine, never lived in Syria, and had never been a refugee. Instead, he had been repeatedly treated in psychiatric institutions since age 18 for severe personality disorder with psychotic episodes. Dr. Anja Keller, a psychiatrist from Cologne, was brought in as an expert. She knew Kemal from several treatments at her clinic and could give investigators valuable insights into his psyche. "Kemal Özkan is a highly intelligent man with severe antisocial personality disorder," she explained to the investigation team. "He's capable of extraordinarily convincing manipulations and can perfectly embody different identities. His delusions of grandeur go hand in hand with complete lack of empathy." Dr. Keller further explained that Kemal had already been noticed several times for similar crimes. He had systematically selected women who had certain characteristics: successful, empathetic, lonely, and with the desire for a high-status partner. "His method is perfected," Dr. Keller said. "He studies his victims for months before striking. He knows exactly which buttons to press to bypass their defense mechanisms." When Claudia learned this information, she felt even more humiliated. She had not only been deceived, but had been the victim of a serial offender who had read her personality like a book. "How many other women has he deceived?" she asked with a choked voice. Detective Weber hesitated. "According to our current findings, at least 7 in the last 3 years. Possibly more." The investigations revealed shocking details. Kemal had built an entire network of false identities. He had different names, different nationalities, and different professions depending on what his victims were looking for. For a teacher, he had been a doctor. For a female doctor, he had been a successful businessman. For an artist, he had been an art professor. Each relationship followed the same pattern: emotional building, isolation from friends and family, financial exploitation, and finally escape just before the truth came to light. Only with Claudia had he gone too far and taken the risk of official verification at the registry office. "Why did he take this risk?" Claudia asked, confused. Dr. Keller had a theory. His delusions of grandeur were probably so pronounced that he thought he could fool even the German bureaucratic system. Besides, the wedding was probably the ultimate triumph for him, complete destruction of your life. The psychological cruelty of this realization was almost unbearable. Claudia realized that Kemal had not only robbed her, but that her destruction itself had been his goal. In the following days, more disturbing details came to light. Kemal had not only stolen her savings, but also used her identity for further frauds. He had applied for credit cards in her name, concluded contracts, and even tried to use her apartment as security for a loan. "The extent of the damage will only become visible gradually," her lawyer explained, a specialist in fraud cases. "It could take months until we've uncovered everything." But the emotional damage was already immeasurable. Claudia couldn't sleep anymore, couldn't eat, could barely speak. Her trust in her own judgment was completely destroyed. How could she help other people as a nurse if she couldn't even recognize a fraud in her own life? Her colleagues at the private clinic showed understanding and support, but Claudia also felt the looks and whispered pity. The story of her failed wedding spread quickly, and she felt like a public curiosity. The worst thing was the realization that she had not only been a victim, but also complicit. She had ignored all warning signs, had pushed away her best friend Miriam, had built her entire life around a man she barely knew. "I was so stupid," she said to her mother while lying in her childhood room staring at the ceiling. "How could I be so blind?" "You weren't stupid," her mother replied firmly. "You were in love and hopeful. That makes you human, not stupid." But Claudia couldn't stop blaming herself. Every memory of her time with Kemal was poisoned. Every feeling of love and happiness had become a lie. She wondered if she would ever be able to trust a person again. 3 weeks after the failed wedding, Claudia received a call from Detective Weber, bringing more shocking news. The investigations had revealed that Kemal Özkan had been simultaneously manipulating 2 other women during their relationship. "We contacted an engineer from Hamburg and a pharmacist from Frankfurt," the detective explained. Both had similar experiences with him, just under different names and stories. Claudia felt like she was falling deeper into an abyss. Not only had her love been a lie, she had also been just one of several women who had been deceived simultaneously. "Would you like to speak with the other victims?" Detective Weber asked carefully. "Sometimes it helps to exchange experiences." Claudia hesitated. Part of her wanted to know nothing about the other women, didn't want to be confronted with the fact that she hadn't been unique. But another part sought answers, understanding for what had happened to her. A few days later, she met with Sandra Hoffman, the engineer from Hamburg, in a small cafe in Dusseldorf. Sandra was a confident woman of 39, but Claudia could see the same broken expression in her eyes that she had noticed in the mirror. "He called himself Dr. Alexander Mueller with me," Sandra told with bitter voice. "Surgeon at Hamburg University Hospital." The story was practically identical. Flight from Lebanon, struggle for recognition of his training, the same emotional manipulations. The parallels were frightening. Sandra had also given money for alleged exam fees. She had also financed an injured sister in the homeland. She had also been isolated from friends. "The most insidious thing was," Sandra continued, "that he was playing us all simultaneously. While he was telling me about his great love, he was saying the same thing to you and the pharmacist from Frankfurt." Claudia could barely believe how systematically Kemal had proceeded. How did he manage it logistically? How could he maintain 3 relationships simultaneously? "He was a master of scheduling," Sandra replied bitterly. "Business trips, emergency services, continuing education, he had an explanation for everything. And when one of us became suspicious, he distracted us with emotional crises." The conversation with Sandra helped Claudia understand that she wasn't alone, but it also intensified her feeling of humiliation. She had thought she was something special, a woman who had found an extraordinary man. Instead, she had been just one of many, interchangeable and predictable. Dr. Keller recommended therapy for Claudia, with a specialist for trauma after psychological abuse. "What you experienced is a form of psychological violence," she explained. "The manipulation was so intense and systematic that what you're going through now are normal reactions to trauma." Claudia began therapy with Dr. Martin Schneider, an experienced psychologist who specialized in victims of manipulation crimes. The first sessions were painful because they forced her to analyze every aspect of her relationship with Kemal and identify the manipulation techniques. Gaslighting, love bombing, isolation, financial control, Dr. Schneider listed. He used the complete repertoire of psychological manipulation. "That doesn't make you weak or stupid, Miss Neumann. It makes him a dangerous expert." Slowly, Claudia began to understand that she hadn't just had bad luck in love, but had become the victim of a calculated crime. Kemal had used her basic human needs, love, security, recognition, as weapons against her. Meanwhile, the police conducted further investigations and discovered more and more victims. The number rose from 7 to 12, then to 18. Kemal had perfected a system over years with which he exploited empathetic, successful women. "He's like a virus," Detective Weber said during an update meeting. "He infiltrates his victims' lives, systematically destroys them, then moves on to the next host." The court hearing was another ordeal for Claudia. She had to describe her most intimate experiences before judges, lawyers, and spectators, admit her naivety, and face the penetrating questions of the defense. Kemal's lawyer tried to portray the victims as complicit. "Isn't it true that you all willingly gave money?" he asked Claudia during her testimony. "No one forced you to do so." "Yes, someone did," Claudia replied with a voice that sounded stronger than she felt. "He forced me by manipulating my emotions, my hopes, and my fears. That's psychological violence." Kemal himself showed no remorse throughout the entire trial. He sat calmly, studied his victims with cold eyes, and seemed to enjoy the attention he received. Occasionally, he even smiled when particularly intimate details of his manipulations were discussed. "He still regards us as his conquests," Sandra whispered to Claudia during a court recess. "For him, we're trophies, not people." Dr. Keller testified as an expert witness and explained to the court the psychology behind Kemal's behavior. The defendant suffers from severe antisocial personality disorder with narcissistic and psychopathic traits. He's incapable of genuine empathy and regards other people as objects he can use for his purposes. She further explained that people like Kemal couldn't be healed and represented a permanent risk to society. His manipulation techniques are so refined that he'll most likely continue even after serving a prison sentence. This assessment filled Claudia with mixed feelings. On one hand, she was relieved that an expert confirmed how sophisticated the manipulation had been. On the other hand, she was horrified by the idea that other women could suffer the same fate in the future. The verdict was finally harsh. Kemal was sentenced to 4 years in prison for fraud in 18 cases. Additionally, it was ordered that he undergo regular psychiatric examinations after his release. "Justice," Claudia said to Sandra as they left the court, but the word felt hollow. 4 years in prison couldn't return what Kemal had taken from them: their trust, their savings, their innocence. Worse still, Claudia knew that Kemal would be free again in 4 years, while she would probably live with the psychological consequences of his manipulation for the rest of her life. 1 year after the failed wedding, Claudia sat in Dr. Schneider's practice, talking about her progress. The weekly therapy sessions had helped her understand the mechanisms that had made her so susceptible to Kemal's manipulation. "I always thought my empathy was a strength," she said. "Now I know it can also be a weakness." "Empathy is a strength," Dr. Schneider corrected gently. "The problem wasn't your positive qualities, but your unconscious longings and fears that Kemal exploited." Through therapy, Claudia had recognized that her longing for a high-status partner hadn't been superficial. It was connected to deep insecurities about her own worth, the desire for social recognition, and the fear of being alone. "I was looking for a man who would complete me," she reflected, "someone who would make me feel valuable. That made me blind to his lies." Returning to work had been difficult. Although her colleagues were understanding, Claudia couldn't shake the feeling that she had changed. The naive, optimistic woman she had been no longer existed. "I don't really trust anyone anymore," she confessed to Dr. Schneider. "When a patient tells me a story, I automatically wonder if they're lying. When a colleague is nice to me, I look for hidden motives." Dr. Schneider explained that this hypervigilance was a normal reaction to trauma. "Your brain is trying to protect you by seeing dangers everywhere. This will get better with time." Slowly, very slowly, Claudia began to trust again. First her family, then her closest colleagues. The process was painful because every step of trust reminded her of her vulnerability. An important moment came when Miriam, her former best friend, contacted her. She had heard about the failed wedding and wanted to check how Claudia was doing. "I'm so sorry," Miriam said when they met again, after months of silence. "I wish I had done more to warn you." "You tried to warn me," Claudia replied. "I just wasn't ready to listen." The conversation with Miriam was healing but also painful. It showed Claudia how much she had let herself be isolated through Kemal's manipulation, how she had sacrificed her most valuable relationships for an illusion. "I understand now why you were skeptical," Claudia said. "You knew me well enough to see that I had changed." Miriam nodded. "You were suddenly so different. Insecure, dependent, always seeking validation. That wasn't you." This realization was another step in Claudia's healing process. She began to understand that Kemal's manipulation had not only distorted her perception of reality, but also changed her personality. Claudia joined a self-help group for victims of romance fraud. There, she met women with similar experiences, even though the details were different. The group became a safe space where she could talk about her shame, anger, and fears without being judged. "The hardest thing isn't the lost money," another woman said during a group session. "It's the lost trust in myself." These words hit Claudia in the heart. That was exactly her problem. She could no longer trust herself. If she had made such a fundamental mistake, how could she be sure she wouldn't be deceived again? Dr. Schneider helped her distinguish between healthy caution and paralyzing paranoia. "It's good that you've become more attentive," he said. but you need to learn to distinguish between real warning signs and exaggerated fears. Claudia began to understand that healing didn't mean becoming the naive person she had been before Kamel again. Healing meant becoming a new version of herself, more cautious but not cynical, stronger but not hardened. An important step was financial rehabilitation. With the help of a lawyer, she managed to reverse some of the fraudulent contracts that Kamal had concluded in her name. Part of her savings was lost forever, but she could slowly build a financial foundation again. Money can be earned again, she said to herself when she received her first paycheck after settling her debts. Trust too. But the emotional damage proved more stubborn. Claudia had several superficial dates, but every time a man showed interest in a more serious relationship, she panicked. The memory of Kamal's charm and his later cruelties made it impossible for her to open up. "I don't know if I can ever love again," she confessed to Dr. Schneider after a particularly difficult day. "The ability to love isn't destroyed," he replied. "It's just temporarily buried. With time, you'll learn to distinguish between genuine affection and manipulation." Claudia hoped he was right, but sometimes healing felt like an impossible mountain she had to climb. 2.5 years after the failed wedding, Claudia had made an important decision. She would use her experiences to help others. She began training to become a counselor for victims of romance fraud. "I thought my story was too embarrassing to tell," she explained to the director of the training program. "But now I recognize that it could help other women." The training was emotionally challenging because it forced Claudia to relive and analyze her own experiences repeatedly. But at the same time, it was healing to transform her vulnerability into strength. Her first counseling case was a 40-year-old teacher named Andrea, who had been deceived by an alleged businessman. The parallels to her own story were frightening. The same manipulation techniques, the same emotional blackmail, the same systematic isolation. "How could you be so stupid?" Andrea asked herself during her first session with Claudia. "You're an intelligent woman. Intelligence doesn't protect against manipulation," Claudia replied with the authority of a survivor. In fact, intelligent, empathetic women are often the preferred victims because they have more complex emotional needs. Andrea's relief was palpable. Finally, someone was speaking to her who truly understood what she had been through. "Did you survive this?" Andrea asked with a tear-choked voice. "Did you become normal again?" "I didn't become normal again," Claudia corrected. "I became something new, someone who has been both wounded and healed, both cautious and hopeful." Claudia's work as a counselor gave her life new meaning. She recognized that her most painful experience had enabled her to help others in a way that would have been impossible before. She also began speaking publicly about her experiences. At the invitation of counseling centers and women's organizations, she gave lectures about the psychology of romance fraud. "Romance scammers aren't just simple fraudsters," she explained to her audiences. "They're experts of the human psyche who use our deepest longings and fears against us." At one of her lectures, Sandra Hoffman, the engineer from Hamburg, was in the audience. After the event, they talked about their respective healing journeys. "You seem so strong," Sandra said admiringly. "I'm still struggling with trust." "Being strong doesn't mean not being afraid," Claudia replied. "It means continuing despite the fear." Sandra told that she had also decided to use her experiences. She was working with the police to educate investigators about romance scammers' methods. "Maybe that was our destiny," Sandra mused. "Maybe we had to go through this to help others." Claudia wasn't sure if she believed in destiny, but she was grateful for the opportunity to make something meaningful from her greatest defeat. On her 38th birthday, 3 years after the failed wedding, Claudia made an unusual discovery. While cleaning up old emails, she came across the first messages she had exchanged with Kamal. For the first time in years, she read his words without the filter of anger or pain. Instead, she analyzed them with the trained eye of a counselor for manipulation victims. "Your work with trauma patients touches me very much," he had written. "As a child, I myself suffered severe psychological injuries. Classic love bombing combined with targeted empathy triggering," Claudia murmured to herself. "Perfectly tailored to appeal to a nurse." The ability to analyze Kamal's manipulation objectively without being emotionally overwhelmed marked an important milestone in her healing. She was no longer the victim of his story. She was the expert who could warn others about similar stories. But perhaps the most important change was subtler. Claudia had learned to trust herself, not blindly, but with the wisdom of a person who had experienced both deception and honesty. When a colleague from the clinic invited her for harmless coffee, she still felt the familiar hint of distrust, but this time she analyzed her reaction. He's been married for 5 years, has 2 children, and just wants to talk about the new personnel planning, she said to herself. These aren't warning signs. This is just collegiality. This ability for self-reflection, to distinguish between justified caution and irrational fear, was perhaps the most valuable treasure she had taken from her painful experience. Claudia Neumann was no longer the naive woman who had believed she was marrying a doctor. She was a survivor, a counselor, a woman who had made her greatest strength from her deepest wound. 5 years after the day her life shattered at the registry office, Claudia Neumann stood before an auditorium full of police officers, social workers, and therapists. She had been invited to speak at an international conference on romance fraud. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began with a calm, confident voice, "5 years ago, I believed I was marrying the man of my dreams. Instead, I discovered that I had become the victim of one of the most insidious psychological crimes." She told her story without shame, with the clinical precision of an expert and the emotional truth of a survivor. The auditorium listened intently as she explained the sophisticated manipulation techniques to which she had fallen victim. Kemal Özkan, that was his real name, is free again after 3 years in prison, she continued. He has already tried to contact more women under a new identity. This shows us that these perpetrators don't stop. All the more important it is that we as a society learn to see through their methods. After her lecture, a young police officer approached her. "Miss Neumann, are you ever afraid that something like this could happen again?" Claudia smiled sadly. "Every day. But I've learned that fear only becomes dangerous when it stops us from living. My experience didn't make me invulnerable, but it made me wiser." She thought of the 13 women who now came to her regular counseling appointments, each with their own story of deception, each on their own path of healing. She thought of the hundreds of emails she had received from women who had heard her lectures or read her articles. "You saved my life," a woman from Vienna had written. "I was about to transfer my savings to a man who claimed to be a doctor. Your story opened my eyes." That was Claudia's true reward. Not revenge against Kemal or restitution of her financial losses, but the knowledge that her pain had been spared others. That evening, after the conference had ended, Claudia sat in her hotel room, looking at the city lights. She was 40 years old, single, and had spent most of her 30s healing from trauma. But she wasn't bitter. She had found work that gave her meaning, built friendships based on honesty, and developed an understanding of herself that was deeper than anything she had known before. Her phone rang. It was Miriam, her best friend, with whom she had long been close friends again. "How was the lecture?" Miriam asked. "Good," Claudia replied. "Painful, but good. Every time I tell my story, it helps someone." "I'm proud of you," Miriam said. "You made something good from the worst." After the conversation, Claudia stayed awake for a while longer, thinking about her life. She hadn't gotten the future she had planned, no marriage, no children, no joint practice with a charming doctor. But she had gotten something else, the ability to help others from the deepest injury. The realization that strength didn't lie in never falling, but in getting up again and using the fall to protect others from the same fate. Claudia Neumann was no longer the woman who thought she would marry a doctor. She had become the woman who helped others understand that true healing didn't lie in perfect love, but in love for oneself, with all scars, all wisdom, and all hard-fought strength. In a world where Kemal Özkan and his ilk continued to hunt for new victims, Claudia had become their opponent, not out of revenge, but out of love. Love for all the women she had once been, and for all those she could protect from a similar fate. That was her true calling, she realized as she finally fell asleep. Not to become a doctor's wife, but to be a healer for those whose hearts had been broken by false doctors.